Yesterday, Jewish Australians dared to imagine that perhaps the Prime Minister had undergone an epiphany after two shocking attacks on Australian Jews in less than a week. A sombre and emotional Prime Minister stood in Sydney's Holocaust Museum, declaring that he stood with the Jewish people in their fight against anti-Semitism.
We need an end to anti-Semitism. It is evil. Holocaust survivors came to Australia because we are a tolerant country. We're one in which our whole Australian society is enriched by people living side by side of different faith, different ethnicities, different backgrounds. And we need a whole of government but whole of society as well effort to make sure this is stamped out.
But as epiphanies go, it was rather short-lived. Less than 24 hours later, his government voted at the United Nations for an immediate, unconditional and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. Who says, I support Jews, and in the next breath, Jews should stop fighting a terrorist organisation committed to their destruction? Oh, and there's that small matter of Jewish hostages. Let's go now to Alex Rivchin, the co-CEO of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. Alex, thanks for joining me. Your response to the government's vote at the United Nations overnight?
This is a historic betrayal, and it's difficult to have anticipated this sort of thing, on the back of so many betrayals before it. It's hard to keep being outraged, but this is where we are. This shows the government is completely out of touch and has abandoned its previous position on Israel and a two-state solution. It has called previously for the release unconditionally of the hostages. Now it's calling for the unconditional ceasefire, which would leave the hostages intact. It would leave Hamas and its remnants intact, still able to wage war and rule over the Gazan people. So the fact that Australia is going down this path, and they've warned us, they've told us that they're going to keep moving further and further away from Israel and towards the Palestinian cause. And sadly, they don't see the nexus at all between these sorts of policies, this sort of constant demonization of Israel, this constant blaming of Israel for the ills of the Middle East and the anti-Semitism we see on our streets. But there is a clear connection, because when they vilify Israel in this way, it sends a signal to extremist actors in our society that Israel is outside the bounds of toleration, of what is accepted in our society. And some will then be moved to commit violent acts, as we have seen.
The other thing I don't get, Alex, is whenever the government are asked, why did you vote this way, they trot out this now familiar line, well, we were one of 158 nations or whatever that voted this way, as if somehow consensus proves that you're right. And I might point out, Iran voted that way, China voted that way, Russia voted that way. Just because everyone's doing it doesn't make it right, and it's not an argument as to what was the motive for your voting that way. How do you square this vote with the Prime Minister's reassurances yesterday that he understood the plight of the Jewish people?
Well, clearly the Prime Minister sees no connection between anti-Semitism and these sorts of manoeuvres at the United Nations. He sees no connection between treating Israel as a rogue, as a villain, lumping it together as the Foreign Minister did a few days ago with China and Russia, and then seeing people in our society view Israel and the Jewish community, which supports Israel, as a legitimate target for violence and the sorts of things we've seen in our cities over the last few weeks. And it's a form of blindness to actually not see that, to not see the responsibility the government has to have moderate, sensible policies, to have a mind to domestic social cohesion. There's also an arrogance to it, in my view, because they think they can have this great role in Middle East peace building, when in fact the impact of Australia on these affairs is minimal. But the impact domestically is felt by all communities. So I wish they would be more considerate of what's happening in our own society, and be mindful that what they say and do in international forums, the way that they constantly demonize and move away from Israel and treat it as a pariah, that it has an impact on the Australian Jewish community. But to your earlier point, James, the government, you're right. Every time they vote this way, they say, well, we're one of 100-odd nations and the Kiwis voted this way as well. I mean, that's a very poor justification. It shows they can't actually justify it on the merits of the thing itself. They have to say we went along with the crowd. And something that you learn really in the schoolyard is that going along with the majority doesn't make it right. Sometimes it takes integrity and character to stand aside from that, stand apart from that, rather than just going along to get along. We expect better of our government.
Yeah, we absolutely do. Andrew Bolt said last night on this program that, Anthony Albanese's message of unity is being undone by his ministers spreading anti-Israel messages. Tony Burke, Ed Husic, for example, who keeps saying Islamophobia is just as problematic right now as anti-Semitism. Is it time for Anthony Albanese to pull his ministers into line? Because it's not just his voice that is influencing the domestic debate here. He's got all of these other ministers out there freelancing.
That's right. And, as you say, the words of ministers and senior leaders, not merely the Prime Minister, count. And we've spoken about the lamentable words of the Foreign Minister in the last few days. We saw during the height of the encampments, the Education Minister, Jason Clare, effectively defending the violent chants of intifada and river to the sea, which everybody knows annihilationist calls for the destruction of Israel and its Jews. But at the time, Jason Clare said it can mean different things to different people. The fact that he was willing to give benefit of doubt to people who deserve none, I think said it all. And we've seen Tony Burke say and admit certain things over the last 14 months. The fact that on the streets of his electorate, in the immediate aftermath of October 7, you had people expressing joy about what happened on October 7, celebrating Hamas's vicious crimes. That really set the tone. It then went from there to the Opera House steps, and we know what's transpired in the intervening period. So there's got to be a discipline by the government. And when we put out a call in the immediate aftermath of the Adas fire for the government to review its rhetoric, we weren't just asking for the Prime Minister to do so, we were asking for the entirety of government to really give careful thought to their policies and also to their words.
We haven't heard much from the anti-Semitism envoy who was appointed by Anthony Albanese, Gillian Seagull, but today she's come out and said she wants the weekly pro-Palestinian rallies moved from the Sydney CBD. She's called them intimidatory and harassing. But is it enough just to move them out of the city?
Well, the envoy got to work pretty speedily grappling with the university situation. And I know that she met with dozens upon dozens of students and staff and academics who had faced horrific situations, intolerable situations on university campuses throughout the country. And stemming from that, Ms. Siegel recommended a judicial inquiry into anti-Semitism on Australian campuses, and the government promptly shut that down and kicked the matter to another committee. So she's been out there saying the right things and working hard for the community and to solve this anti-Semitism crisis, but the government clearly hasn't always been listening. In terms of the protests, our position has never been that there should be a blanket ban on protests. We believe that protests are a fundamental right in a free society that needs to be preserved. But that right is not absolute and it's not unlimited, and it can't be allowed to trample on the rights of others. And when you have a situation where people are fearful of traveling into their own city centres because of these protests, where you have a situation where at these protests you have racist slogans, you have clear incitement to violence, you have the portraits of terrorist leaders held aloft, which then inspires the sorts of violent acts that we're seeing. And nothing is done about it. The police either lack the will or the resources to grapple with this. Something has to be done. Permits have to be withdrawn or made conditional. If a permit is given and these sorts of things transpire to protest, the organisation should not receive another permit. So clearly things have to change. And obviously the practice of protesting outside schools and synagogues, I think there's a very direct connection between what happened about a week ago at the Great Synagogue, the protest outside there, outside that place of worship, and the burning of another synagogue, because that act signified to extremists that synagogues are fair game and are legitimate targets for those who have whatever political grievances they may have. So we're not against, protests in any situation, but if they can't be properly policed, if the law can't be enforced, if people can't be brought to justice, the whole thing needs to be closely considered.
Yeah, very well said. Alex Rivchin, appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you so much, James.